Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be solving the May-June 2026 exam that you guys recently gave on the 8th of June, paper 12. Without wasting any time, let's get started. The first question says, polio vaccination is provided free of charge in some countries. How can this be classified? A says demerit good, free good, merit good, or a public good. Now we know that polio vaccination would be a merit good because it would create benefits not only for the individual but also for the society as a whole, right? So because the vaccinated person is protected from the disease, and society is also benefiting in that sense because vaccination would reduce the spread of portfolio. Because so it has a positive externality, which makes C a merit good as a correct answer. It will not be a public good because just because it is provided free of charge, that does not makes it a free just because it is provided free of charge, it does not makes it a free good, and neither it will be a public good as well, because vaccination is not pure public good because it is excludable and rivalrous to some extent because individual doses are given to specific people, so that makes it rival and also excludable to an extent. And obviously it's not a demerit good because demerit good are harmful goods, and so polio vaccination is not a harmful good, so that makes C as the correct answer. Question number 2 says the diagram shows the production possibility curve for an economy that can produce goods and services if the economy is producing at the boundary of its PPC, that is on the PPC curve. Which statement is not correct? Okay, the first answer option says the economy is always producing both goods and services. Now I guess this should be the answer, but let's look at the economy is using all the available resources. This is the correct statement, so this is not the answer. Opportunity cost of producing is constant. Yes, it's a straight line linear downward sloping PPC. It has a constant opportunity cost. There is no unemployment in the economy. This is a correct statement as well because on the PPC curve all resources are fully employed, which makes A as the correct answer. The economy is always producing both goods and services, which is correct because the economy is not always producing both, because let's say if you are at this point, then you're producing zero services and maximum output of goods, while if you are at this point you're producing zero goods and maximum services. So this statement is incorrect, that the economy is always producing both goods and services. So the economy on the PPC does not have to produce both goods and services at the same time. It could be at one extreme point of the PPC in either on the horizontal or the vertical axis, which makes 2 alpha as the correct answer. Question number 3 says, in the diagram, JK is an economy's original PPC. What can cause the production possibility curve to shift from JK to JL? So the curve is pivoting inwards. It's a pivotal shift inwards. What can cause the PPC to shift inwards from JK to JL? So we see that the productive capacity of the manufactured goods is falling only, right? So the correct answer for question number 3 has to be A for alpha, a fall in the output per worker of manufactured goods, because a fall in the productivity of the workers of manufactured goods would reduce the productive capacity, because now what will happen is that each worker would now be able to produce less of manufactured goods, right? So it's going to shift the capacity, productive potential of the manufactured goods inwards because less manufactured goods are now produced, right? So that makes A for alpha as the correct answer. Question number 4 says, what is the most likely problem when a government produces public goods? Now we know that public goods are non-rival and non-excludable, right? So A says consumption of the good is rivalrous. This is wrong because public goods are non-rival. B says not all consumers are able to consume the good. This is incorrect as well because public goods are non-excludable, meaning that people cannot easily be prevented from consuming them. So this is incorrect. C says scarce resources may not be used in the most desirable way. Now you need to understand that for public goods there is a completely missing market. There is no market for missing goods, and there is no market for public goods. When we say there is no market for public goods, we mean that there is no effective demand. I mean, there's no demand and supply and a market price. I mean, there is demand and supply, but that demand and supply is not there down there in the market, which means that there is no effective market price for public goods, which means that when there's no market price, the state or the government will not be able to clearly reflect or understand how much of the demand is there for public goods, because I remember teaching this to our students, that market prices reflect consumers' value they place on the good. It reflects the relative scarcity and the value consumers place on the good, which means that it reflects and which also means that because if there's no market price, it shows, there's no market price that will show the consumer preferences clearly, which would mean that the government may then find it difficult to know how much of the good they need to provide. So if they'll find it difficult to know how much of the good they need to provide, so the main problem would then be that either they may provide too much or too less, which makes C as the correct answer, because scarce resources may be misallocated and hence may not be used in the most desirable way. That is what would make C as the correct answer. Question number 5 says, which statement about economics is not correct? Now, the correct answer, the economic actions can produce unexpected side effects. The value of the correct answer for question number 5 should be D for David. This is not correct because value is often subjective, and different consumers would value the same good differently depending on their tastes or incomes or circumstances and needs. And we know that economics recognizes that people make different choices based on their own preferences. So value in economics is not purely an objective thing. It's a subjective thing, right? So that's what makes 5 David as the correct answer. Moving on, question number 6 says, if the price elasticity of supply for a good is 3 and the price of the good increases by 10%, what is the increase in the quantity supplied? Now we know the formula for PES, which is percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. So the PES is 3 plus 3 equals to the percentage change in quantity supplied x upon 10%. So the correct answer has to be 30. So you just find the value of x. So the answer to question number 6 has to be C for Charlie. Question 7 says, the diagram shows an outward shift in the supply curve of televisions from S1 to S2. What may cause the shift? The supply is shifting to the right. What may cause this shift? Now, it shouldn't be A, it shouldn't be B either, because it will shift the supply curve to the left. Increasing the price of so the correct answer has to be D for David, question number 7, because an outward shift of the supply would mean that firms are willing and able to supply more at every price, right? So if you're increasing the working population, the labor supply will increase. And if the labor supply will increase, this will actually reduce labor shortages, and that will allow reducing firms' supply bottlenecks and reducing their costs, which would mean that it will allow the firms to produce more televisions. So David is the correct answer. Question number 8 says the demand for housing continues to rise as real incomes increase and more construction firms enter the market to build more houses. Which diagram represents the situation? So if real incomes are rising, purchasing power is rising, demand has to increase. More construction firms enter the market to build more houses. This would mean that supply will also increase. It will shift to the right. That would S1 to S2, D1 to D2. A for alpha has to be the correct answer. Question number 9 says the demand curve for a product is The question number 9 says the demand curve for a product is perfectly elastic. Okay, the supply is unitary elastic. What is the value of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus? Now, if a perfectly elastic demand curve is basically horizontal, and what this actually means is that consumers are willing to pay one fixed price, and if they're willing to pay one fixed price, so the market price is exactly equal to the maximum consumers are willing to pay. So there's no extra benefit consumers get above the price they're paying. So the consumer surplus has to be 0. So the answer has to either be C or D. So but if you look at the producer surplus, it says a unitary elastic supply would start from the origin and would be upward sloping. So now so let's say if this is the market price, or any price, if you take any price along the supply curve, so basically at this quantity you still have some producers who are willing to accept price in this range, but they're receiving this price, so you still have a producer surplus. But the actual size of the producer surplus, so producers do receive some extra benefit, so which means that producer surplus exists. It's not that producer surplus is 0, so producer surplus exists, but the size of the producer surplus would depend upon the market price and the quantity. That it would depend upon whatever the price is and whatever the quantity the producers are ending up selling, right? So the producer surplus then has to be between 0 and infinity. That would make C as the correct answer option for question 9. Question 10 says the price of a pizza has increased from 8 to 10. This leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of 12.5%. What is the PD? Percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. Find out the percentage change in price. The difference is 2 upon 8 times 100. That would give you let me take out my calculator. It would give you 25%. Percentage change in price is 25%. It's going up by 25%. So the quantity demanded is going down by 12.5%. The PD has to be what? The P 12.5 upon 25, it has to be 0.5. That's what make 10A for alpha as the correct answer. Question number 11 says, what would be categorized as direct provision of goods and services? Now, direct provision would mean that the government is itself providing the good or service, right? Now, A would be wrong because, see, grant is a financial support to another provider. It's not the government directly providing the service. B is also wrong because regulations are actually controlling the behavior. It's not a direct provision. C is also wrong because subsidy encourages the private firm to provide the service. The government is not providing. So it's still not direct provision. That's what make A as the correct answer. And by the way, A would be correct. That's what make D the correct answer. D for David is the right answer because when you say direct government provision, it means that the government itself is providing the good or service, and it could either be via public ownership or state operation. That the state is operating the industry or the firm, or the state is taking hands in its own matter and providing it. So if the government is taking over a local bus service, it is directly involved in providing that service. That's what make D for David as the correct answer. Question 12 says, what is a transfer payment? A transfer payment is simply, we know that it's a money or support that is given without the person who's receiving or without the recipient of the payment providing any good or service in return, right? So the correct answer has to be B for boy. Food vouchers, because food vouchers help low income households, right? But they are not food vouchers are helping low-income households to pay for food, but that payment is not made by the government for any productive work being done by these low-income households. Nothing is being sold to the government in return, right? So that is what makes B for boy as the correct answer. A is wrong because advertising expense is a payment for a service provided, right? C is also wrong because a loan must be repaid. So it is not, interest-free study loans, although it's interest-free, but study loans given to deserving students by the government. You see, you have to repay the loan. Transfer payment doesn't have to be repaid. So you have to pay the principal amount of the loan. Salary paid to a nurse working in this is incorrect because salary is payment for labor. Labor is a factor of production. So 12 boy is the correct answer. Question number 13 says the diagram shows the impact of a government subsidy on the provision of a merit good. S is the origin supply curve and S1 is the supply curve with the subsidy. What is the total cost of a subsidy? Very easy question. Subsidy, what you'll do is that the vertical distance between these two supply curves would represent the subsidy per unit, right? At the new equilibrium of 40 units. So the vertical distance would be, so what you'll do is that, this is the equilibrium price, and so what you'll do is that this vertical distance, the value is 100 minus 80, 100 minus 80 is 20, so 20, so the subsidy this is actually the subsidy per unit, 20 times the number of units that are being traded, 40, that would give $800, so the correct answer has to be C for Charlie. Question number 14 says, which combination of measures is likely to reduce inequality in income and wealth the most? So you have like 3: income tax, inheritance tax, and minimum wage. Okay. Now, so if I look at the first column, right, income tax, so that's what I taught my students, just look at the most easiest column. And the most easiest column from the face of it looks like income tax. And if I make income tax more progressive, that should be the correct answer. So A and B, I cancel out A and B. I don't even need to look at this. Now, let's look at C. So, okay. So, what we essentially need to do is that to reduce inequality the most, the government would need to use those policies that would basically redistribute. The government needs to redistribute income and wealth towards lower income groups, right? So a more progressive tax would then take a higher proportion from the higher income earners. So yes, that would make that would reduce income inequality because the government could then spend that money on lower income groups through various benefit programs, welfare payments. So also it's considered more fair to tax less from the lower and tax higher from the rich. So income tax more progressive. If you look at the inheritance tax, so if you lower the inheritance tax threshold, it means if lowering the inheritance tax threshold, lowering it would mean that, see, it says tax threshold. meaning that more of the inherited wealth is now taxed. When you lower the inheritance tax threshold, it means that whatever wealth, we're talking about wealth here, whatever wealth you're inheriting, even a small amount of wealth you inherit would now be taxed. So that's again making it more progressive, because because obviously who has wealth? The rich, right? So now you're even the smallest amount of the wealth inherited by the rich, you're taxing it. So you're lowering the so this is correct. This is correct. And for the minimum wage, increasing in the minimum wage would raise the incomes for low-paid workers. So this is correct as well. So that would make C for Charlie as the correct answer. That would reduce inequality in income and wealth. This is a combination of policies, right? So 14C. Question number 15 says health services in an economy are provided by private clinics that charge high fee. The government decides health services should be provided for everyone, not based on the ability to pay. So if the government wants the healthcare to be provided for everyone and not based on the ability to pay, then which direct action should it take? A, close private clinics where provision by the market is inadequate. Increase the tax on profits made by private clinics, nationalize private clinics and remove charging. So the correct answer for question number 15 has to be D for David. Nationalize private clinics and remove the charging. Why? Because the strongest direct action which we can take is to take the private clinics into public ownership and then remove the charges. So this means healthcare becomes directly provided by the state now, and access no longer depends on income now, because now the government will not give access to those based on ability to pay. Everyone will have that access. So the access no longer depends on income now. So you remove the charging. So nationalize private clinics and remove the charging, right? That's what makes D for David as the correct answer for question 15. 16. Why might GDP not be a useful measure of economic output? Application of this. Question 16, damage to the environment is often unquantified or even ignored. This is the correct answer for question number 16, because GDP measures the value of the output, right? But it does not fully measures when GDP measures the output, it doesn't really fully measures the costs of producing that output. So that's one of the disadvantages that we study under measuring GDP. Because if production increases, but it's causing pollution or environmental damage or deforestation, so GDP may rise, but that won't really rise the economic welfare of the economy, of the society. So GDP, that's why we usually also say that GDP might be a useful measure, but because we say that GDP might not be a useful measure, because it sort of ignores negative externalities and the environmental cost. So that's what makes B for boy as the correct answer. That's what it says. It might not be a useful measure of economic output. Why? Because it's ignoring negative externalities and environmental cost. So it's not really giving us a true picture of the welfare in the economy. Question 17 says what adjustments is made to change the value of the GDP from market price to basic price. So the formula that was taught to the students, which was also in the formula sheet, is that basically GDP at basic price would equal the GDP at market price minus the indirect tax plus the subsidy. So what we need to do is that we need to deduct the indirect tax and we need to add the subsidy. And if you look at the answer option, the correct answer is C for Charlie. You deduct the indirect tax and you add the subsidy. C for Charlie is the correct answer. Question number 18 says what are injections into the circular flow? What a simple question. The correct answer has to be A. We know that injections are additions to spending in the economy. And the injections would increase the flow of income and national income in the economy. So there are three injections there, which are investment, government spending, and exports in an open economy. What will decrease the level? Question 19 says what will decrease if the level of employment falls? If the level of employment falls, then obviously our actual output will decrease. If employment falls, fewer workers are producing goods and services, right? So as a result, the economy's actual output will fall. And because what is actual output? Actual output is what is your actual GDP, your current GDP. It refers to it reflects what is currently being produced. The others are wrong. Productive capacity, potential output will not fall because of fall in employment. You sort of get inside the PP, so you have spare capacity. So your actual output goes down, right? Question number 20 says the diagram shows the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves for a country. The initial level of income is Y1. Okay. What is most likely new equilibrium point if there's an increased productivity? Okay, so only the productivity in the manufacturer of domestic goods. So a productivity is like a supply side factor, right? So if you increase productivity, your aggregate supply has to shift outwards. So your aggregate supply curve will sort of shift like this, right? So AS1 to AS2, so or AS1. So what? So which makes C as the correct answer, guys. Come on. So question 20, the correct answer. What is likely to be the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium would be where AS2 or AS1, whatever you want to call it, would intersect the original aggregate demand curve at C. C for Charlie is the correct answer. Question number 21 says, what is the main objective of supply side policies? Now, what a simple question. What is the main objective of supply side policies? The main objective of supply side policies is to sort of increase the productive capacity of the economy and to shift the LRAS outwards. So the objective is to increase the efficiency and productivity of the economy and hence to increase potential GDP and potential output without creating inflationary pressures in the economy. That makes 21D for David as the correct answer. Moving on, question number 22, it says the government reduced direct taxes on consumers and businesses, which means maybe income tax and corporate taxes went down. What are the likely to be the effects of these changes on the consumption, investment, and national output? So if the government is reducing direct taxes on consumers and businesses, the effect on consumption would be, just look at the first simplest column, which is consumption. Let's say for me, for you it might be any other, but the first thing that clicks to me is consumption. So consumers would have, if you're reducing it, right? So consumers would have higher disposable incomes, which will, because they pay less income tax, so higher disposable income leads to higher consumer spending. Therefore, consumption should increase. So the answer has to be either A or B. Effect on investment would be that business would retain more profits because the business tax or corporate taxes are reduced, which would increase the incentive because higher retained profits means it increases the ability and the incentive to invest. So D should be the answer, by the way. And the effect of national output would be, so if C and I go up, AD goes up, and national output, GDP, national output, national income goes up. So that would make D for David as the correct answer. Question number 22, okay, D for David. Question number 23 says an economy has a GDP of 500 billion. The budget surplus is 2% of GDP. So the budget surplus is 2% of GDP. Okay. What is the government spending when tax revenue is $80 billion? Okay, so what you need to do over here is your GDP is like, 500 billion, and your budget surplus 2% of GDP, which means the budget surplus is 2% of 500, which should be what? $10 billion, right? Now, a budget surplus would mean that the tax revenue is more than government spending. Now, your tax revenue is 80 billion, and so what is the government spending, right? So the government spending would be 80 billion minus 10 billion, which is like 70 billion. That's what makes the correct answer for 23 as 70 billion is the correct answer for question number 23. Simple. Question number 24 says, which action might be a part of expansionary economic policy? Now, expansionary policies are basically designed to increase the aggregate demand and sort of stimulate economic activity and economic growth. So, if you look at the answer options, it should be D for David, because reducing the rate of interest is an expansionary monetary policy, would encourage consumers to borrow more as the cost of borrowing goes down, and firms to borrow more as well, to spend more and invest more, and that would encourage consumers and firms to borrow more and spend and invest more. So C and I would go up, so AD would go up, your recessions would end, your real GDP economic output would increase. That's what makes 24 David as the correct answer. Question number 25 says, what is not included in the government spending while calculating aggregate demand? Pretty simple, transfer payments, because you see, government spending would include the spending when AD equals CIG net exports, right? So when you talk about transfer payments, when you calculate this G figure, that is the government spending component, it includes spending on education, healthcare, roads, and infrastructure. You don't really include transfer payments, are not included because they are not. See, transfer payments are not payments for currently produced goods and services, right? Like your unemployment benefits or state pensions or welfare benefits. Transfer payments simply redistribute the incomes from one group to the other group, right? From one group to the other group. They do not represent production. So 25D for David is the correct answer. The US dollar 26 says the US Yeah, 26 says the US dollar has appreciated by 12% against an average of other major trading currencies. What is likely to have caused this? Now, the currency has appreciated. So, the appreciation of the dollar means the demand for dollars has, let's say, increased relative to the supply of dollars. Right. So, one of the strongest causes of currency appreciation is basically a rise in domestic interest rates. It's a very strong cause. It would make, so that makes B as the correct answer, because higher US interest rates would attract foreign investors, right? Because they would earn higher returns on US, by depositing hot money. It would attract hot money inflows, so the demand for dollars would go up, right? So that's what, and the dollar would appreciate. So that would make 26 boys the correct answer. Question number 27: what is the least likely outcome for participating countries of a move towards a free trade? Okay. Now, what is the least likely outcome, right? So free trade would usually increase the, what would free trade do? Free trade would increase product choice. Yes. It would encourage specialization. Yes. It may raise the living standards. Yes. It would result in more efficient production. Yes. So, but what it will not necessarily do is, so free trade does not necessarily make income distribution more equal. Why? Because because of free trade, some workers and firms may lose out if they cannot actually compete with cheaper imports. So it is definitely not going to make the distribution of income more equal. For example, let's say if you're importing, right? So that could affect domestic industries, because now you're importing cheaper goods from abroad. So that domestic industry may shut down. Remember the infant industry argument, which will cause unemployment. So there would be a structural, unemployment in that case. So, while on the other hand, let's say if you're exporting, if you're exporting a lot, so the export sector may be actually be gaining. So on one hand, some of the sectors in your domestic economy are suffering, while the other sectors like the export sector is maybe booming or growing because it's exporting now. So it's not creating a balanced distribution. So it would create an unequal distribution. So 27 has to be boy. It will not necessarily make income distribution more equal. So 27 boy is the correct answer. 28 says which government measure would reduce the protectionism? Okay. So protectionism means using barriers, right, to restrict imports. You're restricting your imports, right? So the correct answer has to be an increase in the level of import quotas, because when you increase the level of import quotas, an import quota is basically a limit on the quantity of imports allowed into a country. So if the government increases the level of quota, increasing the level of import quota means allowing more imports inside the country. So this would reduce protectionism, right? Because the restriction becomes less severe now. So 28 has to be C for Charlie. Which policy will lead to a fall in the volume of the goods imported? 29. Volume of the goods imported. So the correct answer has to be C for Charlie, an increase in the import tariff. Why? Because a tariff is a tax on imports. If the tariffs would go up, the imported goods would become expensive for domestic consumers and firms, and this will reduce because the price of imports would go up because of that, right? But the world price would increase, right? So that would reduce the quantity of imports demanded. So the volume of imports should fall. A is wrong. A cut in income tax rate increases disposable income, which may actually increase the spending on imports. Reducing interest rates would mean more borrowing, more spending, which can lead to more people spending on imports as well. C is the correct answer. Question number 30 says, now question number 30 is a repeated question from the past papers. It was repeated in May, June 2012 as well, I guess in 2017 as well. It says D1, S1 are the initial supply and demand curves of the pound sterling on the forex market. What will cause the demand curve to shift to D2 and supply curve to shift to S2? The demand for the currency is falling, the supply of the currency is rising. The correct answer for question number 30 has to be A for alpha, a decrease in the price level of other countries. Now I'll tell you why. A decrease in the price level of other countries would make the goods and services in other countries cheaper and more competitive. So people in the UK would buy their goods, which will mean that they'll supply more pounds in the forex market to pay for their currency, to pay for the currency of the other countries, because their goods are more cheaper. Supply of the pound will increase in the forex market, while at the same time, since the goods and services in other countries are becoming cheaper because their inflation is falling, inflation in the other countries are falling, then they will import less from you now. Those goods that they used to import, now those goods are already cheaper in their own countries, so they will not import from you. So demand for your country's currency will fall in that context. So demand for pounds will shift to the left, and hence supply for pound will shift to the right. That's what make A for alpha as the correct answer. And with that, this paper also ends. I wish you all the best. Let me know in the comments what your scores are, and I wish you all the best for your results in August. Thank you so much.